Something that is not going away anytime soon is the college football playoff. In fact, it will be expanding more than likely. And several theories out there about how that could possibly happen and when, right? I mean, I think that most people think that we're looking at expansion 2026, right?
Yeah, it would surprise me if it doesn't go to. I saw a couple of ESPN reports even this morning that 14 at this point is more likely than 16, and it will probably be what happens in 2026. And so the big question that everyone asks is, how do we stay engaged with conference championships? Why do we continue to care about conference championships? Lane Kiffin came out and said, hey, why are we even going to play in this thing if we're potentially going to be eliminated? And he said, I'm not the only one that thinks this. I'm just the only one that'll say it. Rhett Lashley, SMU was. Say what?
Which is very par for the course for Lane.
For sure. Rhett Lashley, though, undefeated in the ACC, said the same thing. Like, you're telling me that I could just take a bye this weekend and be in the playoff, and if I go lose this thing, I might get voted out? Like, what's the advantage of going and playing it? And you look at the two teams that won the conference championships. They literally got the hardest two, the Big Ten and the SEC. They got the hardest two roads, right? And so I think that conferences realize that the value of their championship games for the totality of the sport. Now, I do think there's still some pride in winning your conference, right? And they haven't totally gotten rid of that yet in college football, but it seems like it's coming. That is still there, but the value toward, winning it all, like what you're doing to accomplish the ultimate goal, seems to be fading. And so conferences trying to figure out what they can do to breathe some life back into that, reverse that trend. It does seem like that's at least a positive that conferences are trying to figure out. So two big options, right? The Big Ten and the SEC considering one thing together, not together, but like kind of the same idea. And then the SEC kind of has a weird one that I don't love, but let's talk about it. The Big Ten kind of thinking of an idea where your top 6 teams qualify for what we know as conference championship weekend, where number 1 and number 2 would play each other for the conference championship. Both of those teams are in no matter what. That would just literally be still the Big Ten championship. Winner gets the number 1 seed, loser gets the number 2 seed in the Big Ten's final rankings. And then 3 plays 6, 4 plays 5, and the winners of those 2 games move on. So 1 and 2 in no matter what, winner is the Big Ten champion. If 3 beats 6, and 4 beats 5, then 3 and 4 are in. The SEC considering that option as well. I don't hate that. Like, it's fine. Again, you're protecting the regular season somewhat because 1 and 2 still play for the title, and then 3 through 6 get a chance to play their way in. The other one that the SEC is considering is 4 play-in games, 1 versus 8, 2 versus 7, 4 versus 5, 3 versus 6. I hate that. I think that is just incredibly stupid. I don't necessarily think that the team that finishes 8th should be in a one-off game where the number 1 team who maybe went undefeated in conference or maybe just had 1 loss is playing a team with 3 or 4 losses and has a chance to not make the playoff at that point. Like, could you imagine a scenario where Ole Miss, this year it would have been number 1 Texas against number 8 Ole Miss. Ole Miss just gets hot in one game or Texas struggles in a game. What they've done over the entire regular season is all of a sudden just thrown away, and number 8 gets to go on and number 1 eliminated. So I don't mind the first option. Nothing is perfect in my opinion. Perfect would be backing up 15 years and running with that. That's not going to happen. I don't mind the option number 1. I hate the SEC's second option. I think it's just ludicrous to do that. So anyway, what are your thoughts?
I hate both options. I hate the second option more, obviously, because I just think it's asinine. And I think you and I had a phone call about this a few days ago. I think it was you that made the statement where you were like, I think they just threw that out there so that they could say there was a second option and it made the first option more appealing. And that's very much what it feels like because it completely devalues the regular season, which in theory is what the SEC says they're trying to protect. And I just think it's wholly stupid. But I feel like we're solving a problem that doesn't actually exist. And that's bothering me. I'll get to that. But for me, the very simplest thing before we expand, before we do anything else, is to just not have these automatically seeded 1 through 4. That I think eliminates a lot of problems. Let's do exactly what we did last year, but let's be honest about how we rank them 1 through 12 and seat them in that way instead of anybody getting an automatic, 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 because they won their conference, because that's why we watched some of the very difficult games for like an Ohio State or for whatever. That's why the seating was messed up. So let's try it that way before we completely implode it and do something else that I think is even more dumb. But so let's go back to the first theory. I just think it's solving a problem that doesn't exist. And I know that people say that conference schedules are not equitable. And we need it because you could both play in the Big Ten or both play in the SEC, and one of you play, 6 top 25 teams, and one of you play one, and that's not fair. And I do understand that feeling, and I do think that conferences should do a better job, particularly if we're only going to release 2 schedules at a time, being more balanced about how we do the scheduling. It was more difficult when schedules were released, 9 years ahead of time, to look at our crystal ball and determine how many top 25 teams we were giving each school, right? It's a little bit easier when we're only doing it 2 years at a time, which is currently what we're doing. But let the SEC will have their championship weekend. More than likely 1 and 2 will go in. That will be fine. We have the at-large bids to determine everything else. I think that that's how we protect the integrity of the game. I don't think it's that we need some playoff system to get into our conference championship before we go to the actual playoff system. And I think what will end up happening there is we'll end up canceling regular season games, because one of the other arguments that we talk about for maintaining playoff size and things like that is to protect players. And I think it was Crane that made this point on our show last week. And it's essentially like there is a tipping point where we say there's too many games, we're risking injury on these players. And are we doing that if we're setting this up and now 8 teams are playing conference weekend instead of 2? So I hate both, honestly. I do. I think it's far too drastic. I think it's much smarter, much more prudent to kind of make tiny tweaks to the 12 that we have and at least see if that can work before we expand. I would be a huge proponent, and you know this, if you've watched the show more than once, you at home know this as well. I'm a huge proponent of the BCS formula. Why can we not use the BCS formula to determine? We don't need 12 people sitting in a room, not even drinking beer or wings, so I trust absolutely nothing coming out of them if you've seen all of these videos from inside those rooms, to determine who goes where. Why can't there be a formula that takes into account strength of schedule, conference, win-loss, how much you won by, the BCS that already existed and almost never got it wrong back then?
So the only like argument that I would have against that, not the BCS specifically, because I'm fine with that over the committee. What it feels like it does to me is in the SEC specifically, let's use that conference. You felt like you had six teams that had a really good argument, right? So Texas and Georgia, Tennessee all got in, but then you had 3 more teams that felt like they had a really good argument. Alabama, Ole Miss, South Carolina. Alabama, gets in if Clemson doesn't win the ACC. Ole Miss was a team that won 10 games this year, 9 in the regular season. South Carolina, probably the hottest team down the stretch, winning 6 of their last 6 games. And so I think that what it would do is it would do 2 things. And here's why I kind of buy in.
Games too, didn't they?
They lost to Texas in there. But
lost 5.
So I think it would do a couple of things. It would help. It would take away the advantage of teams that didn't have to play conference championship weekend, and it would make them play that weekend, right? So it's adding more games, but it's just leveling the playing field. Like Texas and Georgia had to play an extra game, and everybody else got to just sit back and rest up for the playoffs, right? So it would level that a little bit, and it would settle those debates, right? The debates that we had over, hey, Texas and Georgia, you're already in. But Alabama, Tennessee, South Carolina, Ole Miss, hey, we're going to give you guys a chance to settle on the field. So to me, it's just a play-in game for the playoff, right? Number 1 and number 2 are already in. It's, okay, Alabama, you want to be in? Go out and win a game, right? Okay, LSU, you want to be in? Go out and win. Well, LSU wouldn't have been in.
I think you are giving SEC fans, college football fans in general, far too much credit if you think that we're just going to let that lie, that it settles it on the field. There's just going to be some other type of argument that's created after that. Like
it does take some of the objectivity out. Like if you know at the beginning of the season, you have to do X, Y, Z, you have to qualify in the top 6, and then you have to win 1 game, right? Or qualify in the top 2, and then you're in automatically. I don't hate that idea. I also think that just from the perspective of, like we just said, the teams that got to sit, like the Ohio State that got to sit in not playing the playoff, right? Or not playing the conference championship game and then just lay waste to everybody. They would have had to prove it on the field. And I think now they may have won that game by a million, right? Like they did every game in the playoffs. But I do think, I don't know, I don't hate it from that perspective because we are still in that model. We are still protecting the SEC championship. Like that is a 1 versus 2 matchup. There's no qualifier for it. And the winner of that game is the SEC champion. And then we're just making the rest of it play-in games. Like one play-in game, you're equaling you're adding games for some teams, but you already added games for Texas and Georgia, right, as number 1 and number 2. And so you're just kind of leveling that playing field where everybody's kind of playing. I don't know. I don't hate it as much as now that I'm talking through it. I think it kind of levels things out. Again, you can qualify by just winning, right? Like that's all you got to do is win your games and you get in. And so I don't know if we would have had this year, if you'd have had 3 versus 6, so that would have been Tennessee versus Ole Miss, right? Tennessee versus South Carolina and Alabama Ole Miss, and the winner of those 2 games get in.
Yeah.
Like that's not terrible. Like that'd be, we'd certainly watch that. And again, we've talked about like more football, better football. I don't know, but
expanding the playoffs without calling it expanding the playoffs.
Essentially, you're having the conferences have a play-in game. All right, how about this? I like this. I have never done this on here or anywhere else, but defending the ACC is certainly not my forte. Now they have less teams, so this is kind of a toned down version of this, but they floated 2 ideas. Much like the SEC, I like the first one. I hate the second one. They floated the idea of the number 1 seed in the ACC just getting an automatic bid to the playoffs. Like they don't even play. They're named the conference champion and they're in. And then 2 and 3 play for the ACC's second bid. Obviously, what's been floated is that the SEC and the Big Ten would get 4, the Big 12 and the ACC would get 2. So the ACC has less teams that need to play to figure this out. But I don't necessarily hate that. Your number 1 seed gets an automatic bid. They're in no matter what. They're crowned the champion of the conference. And then 2 and 3 play for a playoff spot. What that would look like this year is that if we had 14 teams, SMU would have made it, and then Clemson, Miami would have played for a spot in the playoff. Like that and that wouldn't be a conference championship game, though it happens on conference championship weekend. It would just be a play-in game, kind of what the SEC has with 4 and 5 and 3 and 6. I don't think that's a terrible idea. It's very similar to the SEC and the Big Ten's first model. They just have less teams playing, and the number 1 seed is rewarded by not having to play an extra game. I don't think that's terrible. Their other option is kind of a 2-weekend system, 1 versus 4, 2 versus 3, and then the next week, the winners of those 2 games would play. I do hate that one. I think that's stupid. I don't really see the need to add extra games. I very much like the first one more. But I do kind of like the idea of rewarding the team that wins the regular season. I like rewarding them. Like we haven't always had conference championship games, right? Like this is, relatively new in the lifespan of college football that's, 120 years old now. I kind of like the idea of rewarding the team that won the conference in the season, giving them a week off, giving them a bye week, because it is always kind of funny to me that the teams that finish first and second in a conference have to play an extra game. Obviously they want to play that extra game. They want to win the SEC, but in a sport where we've now added 4 more games to the end of it, playing that extra game is certainly like, I don't want to call it a detriment, but it's tough. I mean, it puts more on you, right? If you got to play your 12-game season,
it's more, it is
just more wear and tear. So I kind of like the idea of giving that 1 seed an advantage. Like, hey, you won the regular season. You don't have to play in this, right? Like you are our champion. We're not going to make you play extra games. You get a little bit of an advantage for that. And so again, I hate to give the ACC any credit at all, but I don't hate that idea. I think it's kind of a good one.
I don't love it. I don't necessarily hate it. My concern would be the fact that we don't really have, like we've talked about a million times, equitable scheduling within our conference. And so, I think this year you look at Georgia and Texas, and I can totally see why you would justify just crowning Georgia the national champion because Texas and Georgia played in the regular season, right? For the SEC championship, yes, but they played in the regular season, right? So that was decided on the field once, and then they played again, and it was decided same outcome on the field a second time. But it concerns me, like we did our SEC preview show last year and we talked about Missouri and we were like, well, they could sleepwalk to 10-2 with that schedule. They should. And then we could look at, let's say a Florida team, and Florida was down last year, so they weren't going to be playing in the SEC championship game, but this is just an example. And we could see like, oh shoot, well, they got to play Georgia. They got to play Texas. They got to play Tennessee. And so what if your person with the best record just had the easiest schedule and you took away the option of it to be decided on the field in a conference championship? You just went ahead and crowned them and they had the easier path. And that would be my concern. It wouldn't happen every year, right? But it is a possibility in any given year.
Yeah, the conferences have to do a better job
They
of
do.
scheduling. And, I almost think they're in an impossible spot because what they're trying to do is they're trying to protect rivalries.
Which
And
is also important and
you
something we have
can't,
to hear about.
I don't know that you can protect rivalries and make schedules
Scheduling.
1-12 or 1-16 that even. Like there's always going to be somebody that has a little bit of an easier road, right? Or a lot easier road because Florida, until they do away with this, like you think about Florida, you mentioned Florida, for example, like they're always going to play Georgia, they're always going to play Tennessee, and they're always going to play LSU. Well, in today's college football, that's 3 really tough games that most teams are not going to have to play those kind of games. And then you know what? They're always going to probably play one of Texas and Oklahoma, right? And then you're going to get Bama factored in there some years as well, right? And so there are going to be years where Florida's schedule, just because of who their natural rivals are, is going to be tougher. But then you look at a team without natural rivals, right? Like a Missouri, right? And they don't have a Georgia on their schedule every single year, and they don't have a Bama on their schedule every single year. And I mean, I think about LSU with the rivalries too, right? Like or Auburn, or Tennessee, who have to play Alabama and Georgia every single year. Like you think about Florida, but Auburn's kind of in the same boat. And so, what are you going to do first? Are you going to I just don't know that you could have both. I don't think you can have all these protected rivalries and have equal scheduling. And so one of those two has to be sacrificed. And it's like, as a Florida fan, do you want to not play Tennessee every year or do you want to have equal scheduling? Right? Like that's a very real question.
And the thing that I think will be asked the most is what is the better for revenue? Because that's what actually is king in this. They're not asking the fans, but I would think the rivalries, more
correct.
beneficial financially, which is how we have this lopsided scheduling in the way that it is anyway. But I think there are some things we could do better, and if, let's say, you're trying to protect LSU, Georgia, and Tennessee for Florida, because you're only planning 2 years out, maybe you should be throwing Vanderbilt and Missouri and Kentucky on there. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like more of maybe it shouldn't have been a Texas and I don't know. I think you could be a little bit more deliberate and close the gap a little bit. I think you're right. And write it down. I said it. I think you're right that you're never going to have it be perfectly balanced. And I do think protecting rivalries at the end of the day is more important, but I think we could do a little bit better job. And not planning schedules so far out in the future should allow that change to happen. And that's where we are right now.
Yeah, I also think that obviously adding Texas and Oklahoma threw a huge wrench into things. And again, realignment is something that is huge in the sport right now. And as a Florida State fan, certainly want to get out of the ACC. But I mean, just in general, I don't like realignment. Like I don't like Texas and Oklahoma in the SEC. I don't like Oregon and Washington and USC in the Big Ten. Like all that's kind of stupid to me. So there's no going back. It's not like things are going to change or fix.
Right.
But I don't like any of that. That's all stupid to me. It's a stupid thing. But like Florida State and North Carolina State have a great rivalry. Like every time that game happens, like it is. Florida State fans hate going there, and people don't even think that's not like one of the big national rivalries. That's not FSU Miami or FSU Clemson or anything like that. But that's going away eventually. Like that game is not going to happen, and so yeah, stuff like that sucks. Like, and so yeah, I don't know. But them adding Texas and Oklahoma threw a wrench into things. But I mean, yeah, you mentioned like we mentioned the Floridas and the Auburns and things like that. And look at the difference in Texas's schedule coming into the SEC. Like we give Oklahoma such a hard time. Oklahoma plays like 7 teams in the top 25 this year. They play the most in the country. Based on the early 25 is not out, but just based on the Vegas odds to win a championship. Sure. And Texas plays like 2. And so you look at the schedules that Texas and Oklahoma were given coming in, and Oklahoma fans got to be like, dude, what? Like,
Yeah.
they weren't a good team, but still, like if they'd have played Texas' schedule, they certainly would have had more wins. And if Texas would have played Oklahoma's, I would imagine Texas would have had a loss or two more. So,
Yeah.
even just looking at those two teams coming in, it wasn't very even. But again, how do people get paid a lot more money to figure out schedules than us. So